say. Okay, so welcome back to the early church. And tonight, in our first hour, we're talking about the great persecution and the rise of the Emperor Constantine, arguably the first Christian emperor. And we will talk about that question before we're done. So, just to catch you up, it's been about 40 years since the last real persecution. Christians and non-Christians have found a way to get along in a lot of the cities of the empire. And non-Christians, in fact, are getting used to actually seeing church buildings. Remember when we started this course, I said at the beginning of the church, Christians met in homes. You couldn't walk down the street and see a church, as in a church building. But now that's starting to happen because homes became converted into being worship spaces. And then later on, other buildings were used for worship. And eventually, we've gotten to the point now where even though Christianity is technically still not a legal religion, there are buildings that are designated only for Christian worship, and pretty much everybody knows where they are and what they're for. Many of the Romans are becoming more accepting of various forms of monotheism. So the idea of Christians worshiping only one God is not so unheard of as it used to be. And in fact, there are some cities in the Roman Empire that actually have a majority Christian population. In some places, it's thought that only the people who live out in the rural areas and people who have government jobs are the only ones that still cling to the old traditional Greco-Roman mythologies. In fact, our word pagan comes from the Latin pagani, meaning the country dwellers, the people who live out in the rural areas. And so in some places, in some of the bigger cities, there's a feeling like, well, you know, it's only the rural people who still hold on to the old myths. All of this allowed the church to get comfortable in the empire. And some people would say that the church got too comfortable. And even during this time, some Christians critiqued the rest of the church for becoming lax, in a sense, no longer feeling the need to live counterculturally. And so, and also the lack of persecution brought factions out into the open. So there were factions within the church that now came into the open and began arguing amongst themselves now that they no longer had a prominent common enemy in the persecutors. And so, bottom line is, they can't see what's coming. What's coming is the last and greatest and worst persecution of the church by the Romans. We've referred to it as the Great Persecution. In fact, some early Christian writers would even eventually say that the Great Persecution was God's punishment on the church for becoming lax in its living and its morals and for allowing these factions to develop within the church. So, in the year 285, a new emperor came to the throne. His name was Diocletian. I put his name up here, and this chart will make sense to you in a minute. But Diocletian becomes emperor in the year 285. And one of the things he did was he moved his capital to the east. Now, those of us who are from the West have this idea in our minds that the West is more developed and more economically sound, and we have this idea that we are from the first world and that there are these third world countries. And, again, those of us who have grown up in the West, live with this sort of prejudice that somehow, in the East are all these places that are backwards and, not as well developed as the West. That's what we think. Whether or not it's true, different story. But what you need to know about the ancient world is you have to reverse that. Because in the ancient world, it's the East that is thought to be more developed, more economically sound. There's more wealth in the East. And so we're moving into an era of history when the East is becoming the desirable place to be, as opposed to the West. So what does Diocletian want to do? He wants to move his capital, and in fact his court, to the east, to the city of Nicomedia. Nicomedia, it's over there in Asia Minor in what is now Turkey. Now, Diocletian has two main goals for his reign as emperor. He wants to stabilize the borders, and he wants to get back to traditional religion. He wants to bring back the glory days of the empire, very much like Decius did. Remember, we learned about him. And so he wants to bring back traditional religion. To accomplish the first goal, stabilizing the borders, he created what's called a tetrarchy. Tetrarchy is a word that means the rule of four. There are four rulers. And so what he did was he divvied up the empire among four emperors, in a sense. And so the empire is split between east and west. And then within each of the east and west, there's a senior emperor called the Augustus and a junior emperor called the Caesar. Now, before this time, those titles have become pretty much synonymous, or just part of the multiple titles of every emperor. But now the titles come to mean different things. The Augustus is the senior emperor. The Caesar is the junior emperor. So, obviously, Diocletian reserves for himself the best position. He's the Eastern Augustus. So he's the highest emperor in the best part of the empire in the east, with his new capital in Nicomedia. Now, his second in command in the east is his son-in-law, Galerius. Now, what you have to remember is that when an emperor wants to choose a successor or a second in command, often the way they cement that choice is by marrying their daughter to that person. And so Galerius is Diocletian's son-in-law because Galerius married Diocletian's daughter, right? All right, so you get that. Now, in the west, the Augustus chosen was a guy named Maximian, and the Caesar is the general Constantius. Now, spoiler alert, Constantius is Constantine's father. All right, so just so you see where the story is going here. The western capital is actually going to be in the city of Milan. You know where Milan is, right? Northern Italy? Milan is becoming more important than Rome, and will continue to do so for a while, because it's more centrally located in what we now call Europe. They didn't call it Europe then, but you get the idea. Milan is more centrally located, so the western capital is shifting more towards Milan. Constantius also became the son-in-law of Maximian by marrying Maximian's daughter. But in order to do that, Constantius had to divorce Constantine's mother, Helena. Remember her for later. She's going to be important. She is, by the way, Saint Helena. But she is Constantius' original wife and the mother of Constantine. So keep that in mind. All right. When the Tetrarchy is created, Constantius' son, Constantine, moves to the east, basically to be a general in Diocletian's army, and to live in the eastern capital and in the eastern court. So that's the organizational structure that Diocletian set up in order to try and stabilize the borders. And it's actually kind of brilliant. And it actually kind of worked for a while. Now, on the second goal, to bring back the traditional religion, remember that I said that by this time, Christians have become sort of somewhat acceptable in Roman culture. And so that means that they're not afraid to speak up as a group. And they don't really see any more persecution coming. They've started to think that maybe that's all behind them. And so when Diocletian proposes this agenda of bringing back traditional religion, he was openly criticized by the Christians. This brought back some anti-Christian feelings. We also have certain philosophers who are writing anti-Christian documents. And even though the average person was not necessarily opposed to the Christians, the elites, like the philosophers and the emperors, they would have seen even that as a dangerous thing. In other words, it's dangerous that the average person doesn't realize how dangerous these Christians are, right? So Christians are still considered to be, in a sense, subversive and anti-Roman because even though a lot of the old rumors of cannibalism and incest have sort of gone by the wayside, there are still aspects of Christianity that are seen as against Roman culture. Like, for example, the way the Christians are now blessing unions that are not legal marriages. And the way that the Christian church is using certain corporation laws, like, the way you might create a funeral society or something as a corporation. I believe we talked about that. But the Christians are using that to own buildings for Christian worship. So to have church buildings. In fact, in the capital of Nicomedia, Diocletian could look out of his balcony from his palace and see the Christian church, and that bothered him. On top of that, Diocletian's wife and daughter, so Diocletian's wife and then his daughter, who was Galerius' wife, were probably Christians. If they weren't Christians, they were highly sympathetic to the church, but I would go so far as to say that they probably were Christians. And so this bothered Diocletian and Galerius. It especially bothered Galerius. And so Galerius has what we might call pressure from two sides. He's got a Christian wife, and he's got a Christian rival in Constantius. Now, there's debate over whether Constantius was in fact a Christian, but it seems pretty clear because whenever there's going to be persecution, Constantius almost never allows it to be enforced in the areas that he's in charge of. And so we'll talk about that in a bit. But probably because Galerius saw Constantius as a rival and because of conflict in his own home, Galerius seems to have been the one who instigated the persecution and pressured Diocletian to really begin persecuting the church again. According to the story, in the year 299, one of the eastern armies was planning to go into battle, and you know what they always did before they went into battle was they consulted the augurs, the soothsayers, who then opened up the entrails of some poor sacrificial animal, and they would read the entrails and try to discern whether this was a good day to go into battle. Problem was, on this particular occasion, it was noticed that when the soothsayers were trying to read the entrails, there was a bunch of Christians in the legions who were crossing themselves. Now back then, crossing yourself probably meant doing like this. The cross on the forehead, not necessarily the big one like this, but either way it means the same thing. It's like, here's a bunch of Christians who don't want to have anything to do with this pagan sacrifice that's going on, so they cross themselves. But it was seen as the kind of lack of faith that would interfere with the soothsaying or the augury. So when the pagan priests who were trying to read the entrails couldn't do it, guess who they blamed? They blamed the Christians. And so the persecution, the great persecution, begins originally with an attempt to purge the legions of Christians. We're going to get all the Christians out of the army, because if we don't, how are we ever going to know whether we're supposed to march into battle or not? And so eventually, so originally what they did was they said, well, all soldiers have to make a pagan sacrifice to prove their loyalty to the legions. And if they don't, they have to quit the military. So originally it was just sacrifice or quit. But before too long it evolved into sacrifice or die. But see what's happening here. The participation in a pagan sacrifice is used as a test of loyalty. And to fail to perform that test of loyalty is admitting that you're guilty of treason, basically. And so treason is a capital offense. And so anyone who refused to make the sacrifices could be at least imprisoned and or tortured, but probably also could be executed as well. On the other hand, all you had to do was make the sacrifice to earn your pardon. Well, from there it went to the demolition of churches, and Diocletian and Galerius watched from that same balcony while the church at Nicomedia was ransacked. the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite corps of soldiers, Praetorian Guard broke down the doors and entered the church to find the statue of God, right? Because they just assumed, well, there's obviously going to be a statue of the Christian God in there. When they didn't find the statue of God, they did confiscate and burn scriptures, and then the church was torn down. Galerius wanted it burned down, but Diocletian was afraid that the fire might spread, and so it was only torn down. And then the next day came the first of 4 imperial edicts. The first one coming shortly before Easter in the year of 303. So in the years 303 and 304, we get 4 imperial edicts that essentially emphasize that Christianity is outlawed and promote the persecution and execution of Christians. It begins basically by mandating that all Christian churches are to be burned down and Christian property confiscated. So if you find any chalices or plates or anything has to do with worship, that is all to be confiscated. Any books that are found that are thought to be Christian holy books or sacred writings are to be burned. If any of these things are found in a private home, that private home is to be seen as a church, and it's going to be burned down as well. This led to some demonstrations, some protests by Christians, which in turn led to more edicts. Christian worship was forbidden. Christian meetings declared illegal. Now, they really kind of already were, but they had been tolerated. Christians who admitted to be so could be stripped of any social rank they had, and anyone of a high social rank could be sent into servitude in the sweatshops that were run by the imperial court. Church leaders were imprisoned and tortured. And the law was made that if you wanted to appear in court, you had to first make a pagan sacrifice. So in other words, by saying that pagan sacrifices are required to be heard in court, meant that no Christian could ever have a say in court. No Christian had access to legal process or to the courts. If you were sued, you couldn't say anything about it. If someone stole your property, you couldn't go after them unless you were willing to make the sacrifice. But without making a sacrifice, you would not be heard by the judge. Now, remember when we talked about the persecution under the Emperor Decius, roughly 50 years earlier, and I said, what do you think the Christians did when Decius made this law that everyone had to sacrifice? And according to the sources, a lot of them lined up and made the sacrifice. Not so much this time, because now, even though the people had grown a little bit complacent, they certainly haven't forgotten the controversies over the lapsed and over baptism that happened after the last persecution. So, far fewer people sacrificed, thousands were martyred, and the prisons were full to capacity. Of course, remember, in the ancient world, a prison is not a place where you hold somebody long term. A prison is a place where people wait to either be released or executed. And so they don't have huge prisons, they just have what we might think of as county jail. And so those filled up pretty fast. In the year 304, 2 more edicts. Basically, all inhabitants of the empire must make pagan sacrifice or die, or be sent to work in the mines, which was basically a slow death sentence. Any whole towns thought to be Christian were burned to the ground with the people in them. And the executions of Christians became increasingly, shall we say, creative. In other words, they were meant to be more and more horrible, to be more and more of a deterrent. Because really what the empire wanted was apostates, not martyrs. The use of propaganda becomes part of the persecution. There was a document called the Acts of Pilate. Now think about this, the Acts of Pilate. Imagine a version of the gospel story where Pontius Pilate is the hero, right? That's basically what it was. And so the Acts of Pilate became required reading in all the grammar schools. Now remember, while all this is going on, Constantine, the son of Constantius, is in the east, and he's seeing all this firsthand. According to the story, the persecution wasn't moving along fast enough for old Galerius, so what he did was, Galerius set part of the palace on fire and blamed the Christians. Now, we can't be sure if this really happened. It sounds a lot like the scapegoating that went on during Nero's time. But anyway, that's the story. And the upshot of that was that Diocletian became so angry that he forced his own wife and daughter to also participate in the pagan sacrifice. Now, in the year 305, when Diocletian's health failed, Galerius forced him to retire. When Diocletian steps down, Maximian was also forced to retire as well. And so what we're going to have here is the two Caesars move up into the position of, I'm just going to actually erase this to avoid confusion, but the two Caesars will move up into the highest position, and then as Augusti, and then the idea would be that two new Caesars would be chosen to be their right-hand men. And so basically, here's the problem though. You want to choose a new Caesar, a new second in command for the West. But both Maximian and Constantius have sons. Constantius' son, as you know, is Constantine. Maximian's son is Maxentius. And I'm sorry about the similarity of names, I can't help it. But this is the situation. Both of these sons of the emperors would want to be the next in line, but they can't both be next in line. So Galerius tried to avoid conflict by choosing another man, a third guy, and we're not going to worry about his name right now. But what happened is that Constantius died in the year 306. And before he died, Constantine went to the west to be with him. And when Constantius died, his troops, his legions, said, oh, our great leader Constantius is dead. There's his son. And the son, Constantine, was proclaimed, not Caesar, but Augustus. So the legions now proclaimed our friend Constantine as the highest ruler in the West. And the first thing Constantine did when he gained power in the West is ended persecution. No more persecution in the West. In fact, he gave restitutions to the Christians. He was willing to give back property and rebuild buildings. But the significant thing about this is, theoretically, there is still a higher emperor in the East. But here Constantine is willing to overrule the Eastern emperor's edict and say, no, for my rule, for my area in the West, I am going to overrule that. And what that does is, not only is he overruling the Eastern emperor, but he is now giving the subjects of the Eastern emperor a reason to hope that maybe their emperor will die and Constantine will be their liberator. You see? Because the Christian subjects of Galerius are still suffering under persecution. And Constantine is now the guy who relieves the persecution. And so he quickly becomes a rival to the Eastern emperor, and you can see where that's going to go. Now look, we're not going to go into detail about all the imperial wranglings that go on for a while, because it's very complicated and it's not necessary for you to know it right now. Suffice to say that it includes wars, battles, marriages, murder plots, betrayals, and all of that sex and violence that you would expect from real life. For our purposes, though, it's enough for you to know this. Maxentius is not happy with Constantine as the self-proclaimed emperor of the West. So in 307, Maxentius went to Rome and took the city of Rome. And he was being quite the tyrant. Now, he didn't specifically persecute the Christians, but he really pretty much persecuted everybody. because anyone who had anything he wanted, he created a trumped-up treason charge, had them executed, and took their stuff. Or any woman that he wanted, he took, regardless of whether that woman was another man's wife. And so he was universally hated in the city of Rome as a tyrant. So now the city of Rome is also looking for a liberator. Both Maxentius and Constantine want to be the emperor of the West, so you know it's inevitable that they're going to go to war. So, in the year 312, Constantine has moved down through Italy and is camped outside of Rome, to the north of Rome, on the other side of the river. Now, you may know that the river Tiber runs through Rome, but at the north side it becomes a kind of a border. And there's a bridge that goes across the Tiber called the Milvian Bridge. The Milvian Bridge. Now, Maxentius had destroyed the Milvian Bridge, so Constantine couldn't use it to get into Rome. But that's the spot where Constantine was encamped outside the city. Inside Rome, the people of Rome are rioting and rising up against Maxentius because he's a tyrant and they want to get rid of him. And they actually want Constantine to win this battle. And then we get this great story of Constantine's vision. And there are different versions of the story, but basically it goes something like this. Either the night before battle or that morning in the twilight, or, either in a dream or in a vision, Constantine sees this vision of a symbol emblazoned on the sky. And the symbol is the monogram of Christ. And it looks like this. It looks like a P with an X. You've seen that before, right? This is actually the two Greek letters chi and rho. The X is the letter chi, or sometimes pronounced chi. And the P is the letter rho, which is actually like our letter R. But these are the first two letters in the Greek word or name Christos. Right? So this is the initials of Christ, in a sense. And we sometimes call it the chi rho. It is also called the labarum. But the point is that this is a symbol that would have been recognized as relating to the person of Christ. Now, in some versions of the story, it says Constantine saw a cross emblazoned on the sky. It could very well be that the key can also be called a cross. But you can see how it also relates to the method of execution by which Jesus died, right? He hung on a cross. The only thing is that at this time in history, the Christian church is not yet using the cross as a symbol of Christianity because people are still getting executed on crosses. So that comes in a little bit later. But at any rate, the idea is, and the story is, that this is the vision that Constantine saw. And when he saw this, he heard a heavenly voice say, "In this sign you will conquer." Or, "In this sign, conquer." And so Constantine had the symbol put on his own helmet and on the standards of his legions. You know what a standard is? It's like a banner. It's imagine it's a pole with a cross beam and a banner, right? And so somewhere on these banners, Constantine had the soldiers put the symbol of Christ. So when they went into war, they went into war literally marching under the banner of Christ. And the sign will come to be called the sign of salvation. Now, if Maxentius had just stayed inside the city walls, he might have been okay. But the people are rioting, and they're rising up against him. And he goes and consults an oracle, right? So a pagan soothsayer, right? And what does the oracle say? According to the story, the oracle says, "Today the enemy of Rome will die." And of course, Maxentius thinks, great, they must be talking about Constantine, so I'm going to go out into battle. But guess what? The enemy of Rome is Maxentius himself. And so Maxentius actually went out to meet Constantine. They built a makeshift bridge of boats tied together. But when Constantine was winning the battle and Maxentius wanted to retreat, the bridge of boats collapsed and he fell into the Tiber River and drowned. And later Christian writers will compare this to Pharaoh trying to chase Moses through the Red Sea, right? Horse and rider cast into the sea, the song of Miriam, right? So Maxentius drowns in the Tiber. Constantine is received in Rome as a liberator. And at this point, and we'll talk, we'll get around to the question of his Christianity, his faith. But at this point, Constantine marches into the city of Rome. He's already got Christian bishops in his entourage. And what is the first thing he did? Well, let me tell you the first thing he didn't do. He didn't thank the gods for his victory. Normally, what you do is, you have a victory, you march into Rome, you go right up the hill to the temple of Jupiter, and you make your sacrifices to Jupiter in thanksgiving for the victory. Constantine intentionally did not do that. And it made some people angry, but he was able to smooth it over. But what he did was he immediately undid all of the things that Maxentius had done, and he immediately restored civil rights to the Christians. And he took as his most trusted advisor one of the bishops in his entourage, a guy named Osius. Osius, sometimes you'll see it spelled Hosius, like with the letter H. Osius of Cordova, and you'll see this spelled various ways too, but Osius was a confessor from Spain, and he became Constantine's right-hand man, his most trusted advisor. Now look at what's happening here. And a Roman emperor who chooses as his closest advisor a Christian bishop. The very next year was 313. In the year 313, Constantine issued an edict of his own, the Edict of Milan. Edict of Milan, 313. It's really more of a letter to the Senate and to the governors of provinces, but it granted freedom of worship for Christians. In fact, the letter actually says that it's meant to grant freedom of worship to everyone. So by doing that, Christianity becomes a legal religion. But it is not the only legal religion. It simply becomes legal like the other religions. And it also becomes legal to will money to the church and for the church to own property, because now the church as a legal entity can exist as kind of a corporation and own property, receive wills, etc. And then Constantine says that all church property that was taken during the persecutions must be returned without payment. So in other words, if you're a non-Christian and you've gotten a hold of some land or some Christian property, you have to give it back and don't expect us to pay you for it. Constantine also invented the tax-exempt status for clergy, basically exempting clergy from certain taxes and from certain civic responsibilities, like, for example, having to participate in pagan ceremonies. And he used imperial money to build and rebuild churches. And in fact, this is when the first of the Christian basilicas in Rome are built. The buildings that were built over the graves of the martyrs, or etc., in the city of Rome. So Constantine paid to have these built, and in some cases oversaw the building. One of the basilicas he had built was the original St. Peter's. Not the one that's there now, but the one that was originally on that site. And one version of the story says that Constantine himself, with his own bare hands, broke ground for the building of that basilica. Well, anyway, in the year 314, Constantine has become aware of a schism in the church in the West. And it's the schism of the Donatists. And we haven't talked about these folks yet, but we will. We just haven't gotten around to it yet. So for the sake of spelling, the Donatists are a rigorous faction that started in North Africa. And so Constantine becomes, now with the Battle of the Milvian Bridge and taking Rome in 312 and then going to Milan in 313, Constantine has become the emperor of the West, undisputed emperor of the West. But he has become aware that the church has factioning in it, and one of these factions is the Donatists. And so in 314, Constantine ordered the bishops to have a council. And so this is the first council of the Christian church convened by an emperor. It's the Council of Arles. It's France. Council of Arles. First church council called by an emperor. And in doing this, he set some important precedents. He paid for the bishops to get there from wherever they were coming from. The Roman Empire had a kind of public transportation system, kind of imagine a Pony Express, but he allowed the Christian bishops to use that for free, which in effect makes them privileged on the same level as government officials. He gave Christian bishops the same authority as civil judges, so that they would have the authority to decide issues at these councils. Now, as I said, we're going to talk about the Donatists later, but I'll just give you the spoiler that at the Council of Arles, Donatism, along with rebaptism, will be condemned, right? And so, from now on, when the emperor is involved in a council, whatever the council decides does not only have the authority of the group of bishops, but it has the backing of the government now. And so by participating in this, and by being a part of this council that decides that Donatism is condemned as a form of heresy, and by specifying that when imperial money is given to the church, it's not given to the Donatists, by doing all that, Constantine has in effect reinforced the definition of the church as the Catholic Church, not the Donatists or any other schismatic or heretical faction. Now, just remember, when I use the term Catholic here, I'm using it in the same way as I might use the word the mainstream or the majority. But that sort of begs the question. I mean, the word Catholic, as you know, means universal. But we know that the Catholic Church, as I'm defining it here, isn't really the universal church, because there are Donatist Christians who aren't included. And so, while the word Catholic has come to, it means originally universal, it's come to mean a specific expression of the church, so that it's a way of saying we're Catholic and you're not. It still means the majority. It still means the mainstream. But this Donatist issue is not going to go away. So I just want to show you how, from the very beginning of Constantine's reign, he's involved in the church. Okay, now, the thing is that Constantine is only the emperor of the West. There is another emperor in the East. It's not Galerius anymore. Galerius died a horrible death. And the Christian writers were very happy to describe just how horrible it was. But at any rate, the new emperor of the East is this guy named Licinius. Ironically, Licinius was in Milan with Constantine, and technically speaking, they issued the Edict of Milan together, although it's really from Constantine. But now Licinius is in the East, and now he's persecuting Christians. And one of the ways he persecuted the church in the East was he prevented or made it illegal for bishops to meet together, which meant you can't have any councils. The East has its own issues, which we'll talk about later. and they're not allowed to have any councils. And if you can't gather bishops together in one place, you can't consecrate new bishops, because it takes at least a couple of bishops to consecrate a new bishop. Eventually, the persecution under Licinius escalates to the point where he actually ordered that all Christians should be either blinded or hobbled to sort of mark them as criminals. Well, you know where this is going, right? I mean, both Constantine and Licinius want to be the only emperor of the whole shebang, right? According to the story, the war between them was started when Licinius tried to assassinate Constantine. Whether that's true or not is irrelevant, because these guys were going to war no matter what. Forget the Tetrarchy, that's over. It's now going to be, somebody's going to be the sole emperor again over the whole empire. So somewhere around 316, the two went to war. The war lasted quite a while, off and on. But eventually, spoiler alert, you know where this is going, eventually Constantine became the sole emperor by defeating Licinius in 324. So 324 is the year that Constantine became the sole emperor of the whole empire. And what did he do? Immediately he stopped all persecution and instituted the restitutions for the church, gave the property back, gave money to rebuild the churches. In fact, he even gave money to enlarge churches that didn't need to be rebuilt, because he believed that, you know, now that he was in control, people were going to be joining the church, wanting to become Christians in droves. So he believed that the existing churches were too small, so he paid to have them enlarged. All right. Now, Constantine's mother, remember Helena? Constantine's mother, once the East was secure, made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land in the years 326, 327. 326, 327, Constantine's mother goes to the Holy Land, and she located the sites of Jesus' birth, his death and resurrection, and his ascension. And she brought back to Rome the so-called Holy Stairs, which were the stairs leading up to the Praetorian, where Pilate would have been, Pilate would have made his headquarters when he was in Jerusalem, so that if you remember the gospel story, when Jesus is being tried, he meets Pilate, he's got to go up these stairs. Those apparently were the stairs that were then removed from Jerusalem and brought back to Rome, where Helena was currently living. But the important part here is that on the sites that Helena designated as the sites of the birth and death and ascension of Jesus, Constantine built churches there. So he built the Church of the Nativity over the cave in Bethlehem, where Jesus was said to have been born. Now, you know, remember, whether or not you believe these are the actual sites of Jesus' birth, these sites were not arbitrarily picked. I mean, she was able to ask people who had been living there, whose families had been living there for generations. Constantine built the Church of the Ascension on the Mount of Olives, where Jesus is said to have ascended. He built a church at the site of the visitation to Abraham. You remember the three angelic visitors who came to Abraham, one of whom was treated as a divine being in the Old Testament. He built a church there. And at the site of Golgotha, the site that was said to be where Jesus was crucified, there was a pagan temple on that site. The temple was torn down, and underneath it was excavated. And the excavators found a tomb and some wood, which was declared to be the cross of Jesus. Probably just the cross beam itself, but this is now referred to as the true cross. So on that site, Constantine built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which, if you know anything about the tradition in Jerusalem, the idea is that church encompasses not only the site of the crucifixion, but the site of the tomb. And think about it, the tomb is the site of the resurrection. So, in a sense, that church encompasses the site of both the death and resurrection of Jesus. Now, there's another site that competes that claims to be the site of the tomb, the so-called Garden Tomb, but that's separate. But here's the point. Constantine's biographer, a bishop named Eusebius of Caesarea. Caesarea is the port city on the coast of what is now the north, I guess it's Israel now. But Constantine is Eusebius is the one who writes about Constantine's life. And in talking about Constantine building these churches, Church of the Nativity, and then especially in Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Ascension, Eusebius says, this is the New Jerusalem of the book of Revelation. So when the book of Revelation talks about a New Jerusalem, Eusebius is saying, there it is. Constantine has built it. And this sort of, sets the tone for Constantine's reign as emperor and the way people looked at it and looked back on it. All right. So now, like Diocletian did, Constantine also wants to move the capital to the east. But the existing cities, including Rome, the existing cities are too pagan. He wants to start from scratch. He wants to create a Christian city with no paganism in it. Now, according to one story, he was told by God in a dream, but however it happened, he chose the city of Byzantium. Byzantium. If you want to find Byzantium on a map, you aren't going to find it. But he chose the city of Byzantium and turned it into a new city that he called Nova Roma, New Rome. Eventually, people just started calling it Constantine's city or Constantinople. If you want to find Constantinople on a map, you're not going to find that either, but look for Istanbul, and then you're going to be in the general vicinity. Okay, so, but what Constantine did was he created a city almost from scratch, because Byzantium, there wasn't much there. So he created a city almost from scratch with its own senate and its own court, and made it a Christian city. He started building Constantinople in 326. It was completed in 330, and no paganism would be allowed there. He tore down the temples. He built churches. Any statues of pagan gods or mythic heroes were either torn down or they were turned into the statues of saints by chiseling. I mean, they do a little plastic surgery on the face, right? They chisel off some cheekbones and chisel off some nose, and now it's a statue of Constantine or whatever. Or sometimes it was simply enough to take a statue of a deity out of the temple and stick it in a garden in the middle of a fountain. And it sort of nullifies it in terms of its supposed power or whatever. But at any rate, this is what Constantine did. He built his own Christian city in the east. Now, what that means is that Rome is no longer going to be the imperial capital. And it also means that the most important man in Rome is not in Rome anymore. The emperor is gone. So that left a power vacuum in the city of Rome. In other words, who's going to be the most important man in Rome now? And that role is going to be fulfilled by the bishop. The bishop of Rome will become the most important person in the city of Rome. So keep that in mind, because we're going to sort of track the development of the office of the papacy from the Bishop of Rome to the Pope, and talk about how what are all the stepping stones along the way. And this is one of those stepping stones. This is one of the things that contributes to the increasing power of the Bishop of Rome. All right. Let me just run down a few other things that Constantine did in his reign. Constantine also ended the use of crucifixion as a method of execution. In fact, he discouraged all forms of capital punishment, but of course, capital punishment continued. But he ended the use of crucifixion. This will pave the way for the church to pick up the idea or the symbol of the cross as a symbol for the church, because once it's not being used as a method of execution, it can become a symbol of sacrifice and forgiveness, etc. Constantine also officially ended the gladiator games, but those continued, of course, especially in places where Constantine wasn't physically present. So, it continues even in Rome, in the Colosseum. But the fact that the games are officially ended means that no wealthy person really wants to pay for them. And so there's going to be far fewer of them, and what will take their place is the chariot races. And the chariot races become sort of, you know how passionate soccer fans are in most of the world. They call it football, we call it soccer here, but you know how that is. Well, the horse races become that, and so people are very passionate about their favorite team. There's the green team, the blue team, and you can even buy, mugs with your favorite chariot race team on them, and there are, fans get into fist fights and, the whole business. So the chariot races becomes much more important and more popular after this time. Constantine really discouraged pagan worship as much as he could, although he didn't really try to outlaw it entirely, because that might have been impossible. But he did make temple prostitution, ritual prostitution, illegal. And as much as he could, especially out in the provinces, he stripped the pagan temples of anything valuable. And in some cases, this is where he got the money to build all those churches. His people would go into a temple, and any gold or whatever would be taken and melted down. Anything valuable would be taken, and the rest would be left there. And then this money was used to pay for new churches. A lot of it was given to the bishops to go to the poor. And it was also used to stabilize the economy. Because you remember, we talked, we were in the 3rd century, the economy was in a recession. And so Constantine was able to stabilize the economy by using all of that wealth that was stockpiled in the pagan temples. And as I said, a lot of money was given to the poor as well. Constantine made Sunday a day of rest from work, so you have him to thank for inventing the weekend. I already mentioned that he would give Christian bishops the same authority as civil judges. So now, if you're a Christian and you have a beef with another Christian, the two of you can go to your bishop to settle the dispute without going to the secular court. In fact, if you are taken to court by a fellow Christian, at any point in the court proceedings, you can stop the court proceedings and say, I want this to go and be transferred, change of venue, to the bishop. And they have to do it. They have to allow that. Even if the judge is about to pronounce your sentence, I pronounce you, stop. Now it has to go to the bishop and start over. So you get the idea that the bishops are coming to have this authority on the level of civil magistrates, judges. Constantine continued to have bishops as his closest advisors, even traveling with him. And this is a two-way street, because he wanted bishops' advice on how to run the empire, but he expected the bishops to want his advice on how to run the church too, right? So he expected to be included in those discussions, and he did have a seat at the councils. Constantine made divorce more difficult and made adultery illegal. Now, when I say that, he made adultery illegal, what that means is that it was illegal for a man to commit adultery with another man's wife. But this is going to backfire on him, because by making adultery illegal, he opens the door for Roman men to accuse their rivals of adultery and get them executed. And in fact, this happened to one of Constantine's own sons. Constantine's son was accused of adultery, and so Constantine felt obligated to have him executed. Problem is, the accusation probably wasn't true. The accusation probably came from Constantine's own wife, not the mother of the one who was executed, but the mother of another son. And this wife of Constantine wanted to get rid of the son that wasn't hers to, sort of ensure that her own son would be the heir. So when Constantine arrives in Rome the next time, he is confronted by his mother, Helena, and pretty soon his wife is dead. So, not quite sure what went on there, but the interesting thing about this is that wife was the one that was Maximian's daughter, right? Maximian's land in Rome that he had confiscated, been owned by previous emperors, but before that it had been private land, it had eventually been confiscated. Maximian had taken this land. Maxentius had occupied it. Anyway, now that Maximian's daughter, Constantine's wife, is dead, the land basically goes to Constantine. What does he do? He gives it to the church. And it's on that land that the Cathedral of Rome would be built. Now, the Cathedral of Rome is not St. Peter's in the Vatican, that's separate. The cathedral in Rome is called St. John Lateran, and it's the Lateran land that Constantine got and gave it to the church. All right, so that is meant to sort of demonstrate that Constantine is a complicated character. Some Christian denominations consider him a saint, others not so much. And there are things that he did that we might think are good, and there are things that he did that we might think are not good. Like many men in the ancient church, he postponed his baptism until he was on his deathbed, because he didn't want to be bound by the moral expectations of the church while he ruled as emperor. Emperors sometimes have to have people executed, and Constantine did that. He executed his rivals even when they were members of his own family. He didn't really make paganism illegal, but any non-Christian soldiers in his army, on Sunday when the Christian soldiers were in worship, the non-Christian soldiers were rounded up and made to recite a prayer to the monotheistic God, a prayer that Constantine himself had written. He allowed the Jews to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but only one day a year. And he reinforced the old law that conversion to Judaism was illegal. So again, he didn't make Judaism illegal, but he made it more difficult to practice. In fact, he made converting to Christianity from Judaism much easier, and any Jew caught trying to prevent another Jew from converting to Christianity could be executed for that offense. Jews could not own Christian slaves. So notice he hasn't gotten rid of slavery. He has just said Jews cannot own Christians as slaves. He also made heresy illegal, so that people like the Donatists, I erased them, people like the Donatists or other heretics, not only are they excommunicated from the church, but they are considered outlaws as well. The Novatianists were exempted because, as we're going to find out, while they're schismatic, they're not considered heretics. But the point is this, he's willing to use his government to discriminate against people with differing theological views, heretics. He's willing to use his government to discriminate against non-Christians. Now, there's already a precedent for this. You may remember when we were talking about the adoptionists, and there was that one bishop in Antioch, Paul of Samosata, who they had proclaimed him a heretic, but he wouldn't vacate the church in Antioch. They couldn't get rid of him. So eventually the emperor, who was a pagan, stepped in order to keep the peace. And remember what the emperor said: the church belongs to whomever is in agreement with Rome. So Paul is out. Paul of Samosata is out. But that, also sets a precedent of an emperor stepping in and using imperial and, in fact, military force to enforce church decisions. And so Constantine was happy to pick up that, that precedent and use force to back the church. That was considered legitimate. So what we have to be clear about is that the Emperor Constantine never made Christianity the only legal religion, though he did not allow any new temples or statues to be put up. It was not until a later emperor that we have Christianity as what I would call the official religion of the empire. The later emperor was Theodosius I. And Theodosius was emperor from 379 to 395. He was the first one to rule as a baptized Christian. But even then, he only got baptized earlier because he was sick and thought he was going to die. So they thought he was on his deathbed. They baptized him. He got better. Now he rules as a baptized Christian. So he would have postponed his baptism if he could as well. But it was really Theodosius who ordered that all temples should be destroyed across the empire, and or converted into churches or whatever. And it was really Theodosius who made the pagan religions illegal and made Christianity really the only legal religion. In an edict of the year 380, Theodosius ordered that the Christian faith would be defined as that faith delivered by Peter to the Romans. Now, that's significant, again, because this is another one of those stepping stones on the way toward the increasing power of the Bishop of Rome. Because if you want to be considered Orthodox, you have to be in agreement with the Romans, or the Bishop of Rome. The Bishop of Rome is thought to be understood to be the successor of Peter. And then in a second edict of 381, Theodosius actually made the practice of paganism illegal, or conversion to paganism illegal, and he actually demanded that all citizens be baptized. So the tables aren't fully turned until Theodosius. But from Constantine on, apart from one brief exception, from Constantine on, all of the emperors are going to be Christian. Now, we have one question we need to deal with before we quit. Was Constantine really a Christian? And depending on what books you read, you'll get every answer under the book. But the first thing we have to say is that it depends on how you define the word Christian. Because if you define Christian as a baptized Christian, then obviously Constantine did not rule as a baptized Christian. But if you define Christian in the sense of a believer, then the question becomes, was Constantine really a believer? Did he really believe in the Christian faith? Or was he only faking it to use the church to his advantage? Now, as we're going to see, he does want, or he feels he needs the church to help him safeguard the unity of the empire. Because remember, Diocletian had this great idea. Here's how he's going to safeguard the unity of the empire and stabilize the borders, by creating a tetrarchy and by spreading the rule out among 4 emperors. Well, that's gone. So what makes Constantine think one emperor can rule this empire if Diocletian didn't think that could be done? Well, what makes Constantine think it can be done is he's got the church on his side. He hopes that the church will help unify the empire. So we know that's on his mind. The question is still, was he sincerely a believer, or was he only faking it to use the church to his advantage? And I will argue that he really was a believer. It's clear that his father was a Christian. His father, Constantius, did not persecute in the area under his control. At one point, he allowed some churches to be torn down, but nobody died. And in fact, Constantius also had a daughter named Anastasia, which means resurrection. It's also clear that Constantine's mother was a Christian, Helena. She, we know, was devotee of a particular saint who may have been a heretic, but we won't worry about that right now. A guy named Lucian of Antioch. And of course, as soon as the Holy Land is opened to pilgrimage, she's there. And she's now known to the church as Saint Helena. So, and then, to march into battle under the banner of Christ, you either have to be a believer in Christ or a pretty firm believer that the pagan gods are not going to strike you dead. Right? I mean, you'd have to say, well, maybe I don't believe in Christ, but I don't believe in those other gods either, so we'll go with this. And I don't think that's where he was. I don't think he would risk losing the battles if he didn't really believe in Christ. So I think he was a sincere believer who also wanted to use the church to his advantage. And that's, why I say he's a complicated character. I mean, was he converted in 312 at the Milvian Bridge because of his vision? Or was he a Christian already before that and was just waiting for the right moment to go public? I guess we'll never know. But I do believe that his faith was sincere to the extent that we see it lived out in his life. Eusebius of Caesarea, I erased him, but Eusebius, who is Constantine's biographer, compares Constantine to King David and to Moses. Remember the point in the Old Testament where King David, he's anointed to be the next king, but he's not crowned yet. And so Eusebius compares Constantine to that, in that 306 time period where the troops have proclaimed him emperor, but he's really not, ruling the whole empire yet. And then he compares Constantine to Moses delivering the people from Egypt, where Maxentius is like the Pharaoh, And so Constantine, it comes to be called a new savior, and even a new logos, creating order out of chaos. A representative of God's own power on earth. As if to say, well, Jesus isn't here in physical form anymore, so at least now we have Constantine. Constantine is now God's man in the flesh, God's man on earth. Eusebius said that God was the author of Constantine's victory, that God put him in that position, and Constantine was happy to agree with that. In fact, Eusebius seems to have believed that the empire of Constantine was the kingdom of God on earth. And so Constantine himself, again, very happy to believe that, saw it as his mission and his duty to expand both his own empire and the kingdom of God. Now, the interesting thing, we're almost done here, we're going to take a break, but interesting thing I want to point out to you is that you notice over time a different perspective develops in the East versus in the West. In the East, you have this idea that the king or the emperor is the representative of God on earth. So political power represents God's power on earth. Political power legitimates the power of the church, and the church legitimates the political power. So that in the East, you will always have this concept that the political power is above the ecclesiastical power, that the emperor is sort of over and above the bishops. In the West, a different way of thinking about this is going to develop. In the West, as I already mentioned, the most important man in Rome will become the Bishop of Rome. And so in the West, the opposite way of looking at it is going to develop, where the ecclesiastical power is going to be above political power. The bishop, specifically the Bishop of Rome, will be even over the idea of a king. And we'll see that as we go more into the Middle Ages and talk more about the papacy and the eventual split between East and West, because this will become one of the issues. All right. Now, one more thing to say, and then we'll see if there are questions. As we're leaving it right now, Constantine has now gotten to the point where he is the sole emperor over a reunified empire. And Constantine fully expects that the church will help him keep the unity of the empire. But he gets a rude awakening because the church is falling into schism, or threatens to. In other words, who's going to unify the church? First we have to worry about the unity of the church before we can worry about the unity of the empire, because in the West, you've got the Donatists, and you've got the Novatianists, two schismatic groups. In the East, you have the emergence of a controversy known as Arianism, which is going to be the subject for our next hour. And that's going to be an important issue. So, let's see if there are questions at this point. I know I gave you a lot of information. Thanks for your attention, but what questions do you have?
Would you repeat what you were saying about how the Eastern church, or Eastern part of the empire had political power over the church power? What you said right before that.
What I said before that. Well, I mean, it flows out of this idea that Constantine is seen as God's representative on earth. So if Constantine, the emperor, is God's representative on earth, and in fact future emperors, Theodosius, etc., if the emperor is God's representative on earth, then the emperor represents divine power in the world, in the realm of the world. So the East will go with that sort of idea that the emperor is the supreme power, and in fact, the representative of God's power. But the West isn't going to really have that, because the Western emperors will not be as strong going forward, and while the Western emperor's power declines, the power of the Bishop of Rome will increase, and so in the West you're going to have the opposite view, that the peak of the pyramid in terms of the church's authority will be the highest authority. So to put it in a nutshell, the East will see it this way: state over church. The West will see it this way: church over state. Yeah, so keep that in mind for later. That's going to be important. Yeah.
And then, how did Galerius die?
Galerius. How did he die? Galerius died of some nasty disease. We don't really know what it was, but he died a very slow and painful death, if you were to believe the sources. And in fact, on his deathbed, in the year 311, he issued an edict called the Edict of Toleration, which basically he said, okay, I'll stop the persecution if you Christians will only pray for me, because obviously your God is powerful. And so that was the Edict of Toleration, and theoretically would have ended persecution in the East, except as soon as he died, they ignored him. And the people who took over kept persecuting. So, yeah, but he basically died of some illness that we're not sure exactly what it was. Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks for your attention. Let's take a 15-minute break.